welcome everyone to the Knowing Africa series and to the discussion today, which is a discussion of a theme along a theme that I think is actually very big and yet understudied in African studies, which is what is Africa? What are its boundaries? We're very, I think, become very accustomed to thinking about Africa as only sub-Saharan Africa, and in accepting some of the strange politics that has removed a part of the continent as being in some ways related more to Middle East and Europe than to the rest of Africa. But that is, in my view, part of a politics of definition and exclusion that needs to be brought into focus. So when I saw the work that Cynthia was doing on Blackness in Morocco, it immediately made me think that this would be a way to launch some of that discussion. That's not the main focus of the book, of course, the politics of African studies. But Cynthia Becker, who is an art historian and whose work on visualities I was more familiar with at Boston University, and an alumni of the Radcliffe Institute, which is how we first met. We're fellow alums of the Radcliffe Institute. Cynthia's book opens up a conversation about how music and visual cultures work in establishing identities, and how repressed identities are expressed in these cultural forms that are not obviously politicized, but in fact register across centuries in interesting ways. Her book, Genoa Identity Through Music and Visual Culture, is that the right pronunciation? Do you pronounce the G, Genoa?
Genoa, yes.
Yeah. So Cynthia, welcome all the way from Boston. It's a real pleasure to have you here and to hear more about this book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, and for which I did think would be wonderful to have a little soundtrack, because I kept trying to imagine what these sounds were like. And in conversation with Cynthia, we have Atika Hashimi, our colleague from the University of Toronto. Atika is Moroccan in origin and is a sociolinguist teaching in women and gender studies, as well as they teach in sociology as well, I think. No, Atika?
African studies, women's studies, and linguistics.
Yeah, and in linguistics, whose work actually is also very much along these themes of the politics of migration and the ways in which identity is constituted in relation to migration. So welcome to Atika. Carolyn Ramsey is a colleague from Carleton University, an ethnomusicologist who works on Coptic music and women's voices in Coptic music and religious women's voices, specifically in Coptic music. She is an ethnomusicologist based in anthropology and sociology at Carleton University. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm going to hand it over to Cynthia and to give us a sense of the key themes of this book. And maybe you do have a sound clip for us. I'm not sure.
I do have a sound clip. So I actually was just, as you were speaking, moving the sound clip to the front of the PowerPoint. So I'll play it before long. But Shireen, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so honored to speak to you. I was very flattered by the invitation. My book came out in November, and last November, and it sort of feels weird publishing a book during COVID times because you don't really know if people are looking at it or what's happening. And because we're not going to conferences and things like that as much, except for the virtual conferences, which aren't quite the same. But, it does allow me to speak to all of you who are in Canada. My first lecture, even if it's virtually, in Canada.
Next time in person.
Next time in person, I would love that. Yes, that would be amazing. So thank you, and thanks to the respondents in advance. So I did create a PowerPoint. Since I am an art historian, I'm always used to having slides and images. We call them slides from the old times, right? And so I will go ahead and start the PowerPoint. And I did put together a short presentation kind of outlining some of the key themes and mostly my approach and sort of my background and where I'm coming from when I was writing this particular book. So I first started off, I am an Africanist art historian specializing in North Africa, which is a little unusual. And my first book was called Amazigh Arts in Morocco, Women Shaping Berber Identity. And here's an image from the book. And I'm showing this because my approach has always been to look at performance and music and song and its relationship to visual culture. And I first actually went to North Africa to participate in an archaeological excavation of the site of Sijomasa in the 1990s, and decided to do my dissertation project in this particular area. I didn't do an archaeological dissertation, but Sijomasa was a stopping point for caravans crossing the Sahara during the medieval period. So I got interested in trans-Saharan connections based on that. And I did study with Henry Jewell, who was a Europe art professor who was with us. And so, I am very steeped within the visual culture of West Africa. And so I lived in southeastern Morocco for 2 years in the 1990s and concentrated on writing about Amazigh women's art, in particular Ait Khabash art, which is a large Amazigh group in that particular area. And Ait Khabash live in an oasis in southeastern Morocco called Tafilalet Oasis, and also in the surrounding desert. And so I went to the desert very often, outside the oasis, to meet people, to attend weddings and different ceremonies. And I also went to a small community named Khamlia, and almost every single person who lives in Khamlia is the descendant of an enslaved person. And every year in Khamlia, people hold what they call a sadaqah. So a sadaqah means a gift or an offering in Arabic. And so this is a time when people gather together and they make a big, big couscous, and they distribute it to people who visit the sadaqah. And the sadaqah is organized by the descendants of enslaved people who call themselves Ism Khan. And Ism Khan in the Amazigh language, Tamazirt, means slaves. And so you can see them here in this photograph playing music that is playing instruments that I talk about in my book that are coming from West African prototypes. So kraqab, which are the metal cymbals, and also tabul or ginga, which are the large barrel drums. But they're not playing an instrument really associated with the Genoa, which is the ginbri, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So Ism Khan paid tribute to their ancestors and to Bilal, who was the first muezzin of the Prophet Muhammad, who developed the call to prayer. And he is said to have been Black and formerly enslaved. And Ism Khan say they derived their baraka, or blessings, from their connection to Bilal. And they distribute food, but also some of their baraka at the sadaqah. And they also perform prayers, and there's an animal sacrifice. And, as coming from the United States, and I grew up in the South, I grew up in New Orleans, and I was saying, okay, people are calling themselves slaves. What does that mean? Why would people adopt as a self-descriptor a word that seems to be demeaning and pejorative, like Ism Khan or slaves? And I found that the healing ceremonies of Ism Khan reveal a great deal about racialized identities in Morocco and sort of what does it mean to have this slave past. And Ism Khan, during their sadaqah, they call forth people who wish to be healed. And so they take their turbans off their head because the turban has absorbed some of their baraka. They place it on top of the heads of the people who wish to be healed. In this case, it's a group of women. And they surround them, they play music. And then they also put water into the karakab, the metal cymbals, into the concave portion. They put some salt, and then they put their finger into the water, and women drink the water to be healed. So ingesting some of the baraka from the bodies of the Ism Khan men who are doing the healing ceremony. So they're using their baraka to heal the sick, and especially those afflicted from spirit-induced illnesses. And people explained to me that identifying as Ism Khan signified a link not only to Bilal and also to Blackness, but also to Africa south of the Sahara. And so this added to their special healing abilities. So this connection to Blackness and the ability to heal was what Ism Khan shared with Genoa, which is the topic of my book today, also known to be the descendants of enslaved people. So people in Khamliya suggested to me, if you want to learn more about Genoa and the history of slavery, go to the city of Essaouira, which is located on the other side of Morocco on the western coast, and ask for Mahmoud Ghenia, one of the best Genoa musicians in Morocco. So I went to Essaouira, took the trip, and this was in 1997, and Essaouira was a quiet, small town. And I knocked on doors and asked around and found Mahmoud Ghenia. And after some negotiation, and Henry Jewell was actually there, we had Mahmoud Ghenia played a small concert for us that evening. And so I did record it, and I brought some of that. And, you know, this is a video camera from 1997. So it's not the best quality, but you will hear some of the music. So I'll play a little bit of it now. Okay, so that's a little taste of some Genoa music by an incredible musician. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. So this topic of Genoa visual culture and music allowed me to address one of the most, I thought, timely issues in African studies, this geographic and conceptual divide between North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the division of the African continent into the Arab North and the Black South. So over a period of 8 years, I returned to Essaouira on the coast every year to attend spirit possession ceremonies that were held by Genoa musicians, for which they are renowned within Morocco. And eventually I had a long-term grant to live there. And I interviewed musicians and visual artists and wrote this book, Blackness in Morocco. And it really hones in on Genoa identity, showing how it is made and understood through practices of music and performance. And I also look at how an understanding of Blackness has connected to a Genoa identity, and how it's dependent on the performance of particular types of visual culture. So for example, cowrie adorned hats. This is the musician Omar Hayat on the right who's performing. He's wearing a cowrie adorned hat, and he's playing the ginbri, which we saw Mahmoud Ghenia perform in the video. Also, people played karakab, I mentioned before, the ginga or the tabal. And these instruments do have a Sahelian African ancestry, and they signal a connection to Blackness and to what people in Morocco call a Sudani identity, with Sudani meaning West or Sub-Saharan Africa. And they suggest a purposeful connection of Morocco with the African continent, rather than Morocco as an Arab nation connected to the Middle East or connected to the Mediterranean world. So upon returning to Khamlia many years later, I found that the Ism Khan had renamed themselves Genoa. They had founded a house called Dar Genoa in Khamlia, and they started to play the Ginbri themselves, which they had never played before. So I started to face head on in my book how racialized categories such as Blackness and Genoa as an identity can be a source of agency and self-respect. So why would Ism Khan want to adopt the identity as Genoa? But at the same time, Blackness in a Moroccan context is associated with marginality and otherness, since it's linked to the history of trans-Saharan slavery. So there's a paradox. The performance of Blackness means that one agency is really linked to oppression, but it is this very association of Blackness with alterity and otherness that makes Genoa performances and Genoa music appeal to people in contemporary Morocco. And Genoa music has achieved great commercial success, prompting groups like Ism Khan to really take on this identity and profit from it. So Genoa music has become extremely popular after the formation of the Genoa Music and World Heritage Festival that was created in Essaouira in 1998, which you can see here. And I discussed this festival with some of its organizers, and they told me that when they first came up with the idea in the 90s to have such a festival, local, many people within Essaouira said, why do you want to have a festival that honors slaves? Why would you want to honor these people? What's going on? What culture do they have? So that, of course, has changed a great deal. And today, Genoa as an identity has really appealed to so many people across Morocco, many youth, and also to visual artists, such as the photographer Lamia Naji, who I discuss in my book. And she photographed Genoa spirit possession for use in a multimedia project that she put together called Couleur Primaire. And she takes really unconventional angles and points of view to give her photographs a sense of ambiguity. So we really only see portions of fragmented bodies, leaving really us to wonder as the viewer what extends beyond the photograph and what exactly is the subject sometimes of her images. And she really creates this tension between what is seen and what is unseen. So for example, this is one of her photos from Couleur Primaire. She did this series within the city of Essaouira, and she attended many Genoa ceremonies and was given permission to take these photographs. And you might wonder, why is this woman collapsed in the center of the photograph? And why are people just sitting there looking at her, remaining motionless? And why aren't they helping her? But those familiar with Genoa ceremonies will realize that the photograph was taken after she has satisfied her spirit, so after possession. And she's released from the grip of her spirits and she falls to the ground in exhaustion. So this elusiveness that Naji seeks to capture in her photographs really suggests on a broader level the ambiguity that surrounds the term Genoa and even Blackness. But Genoa can be used in multiple ways within Morocco to designate a type of spiritual therapy, a type of spirit possession ceremony, or to describe a musician, or maybe someone who attends a ceremony. Or maybe someone who attends a ceremony doesn't see themselves as Genoa at all. So it's a very ambiguous and kind of fluid category. And I take on the term Genoa really in the first two chapters of the book, and I consider late 19th and early 20th century photographs, postcards, and other visual media. And I was really interested in sort of the history of Genoa identity formation. And I looked specifically at early images of male street performers. And I argue that they set the stage for Black self-representation. So in other words, the image that people projected to the world also shaped sort of how people learned to see themselves. And I assert that Genoa codification really started at the end of the 19th century. And this is a period within Morocco when the slavery system is really in decline. Many of the elite lost a lot of their power due to increased European incursions within Morocco. And many people were manumitted from slavery or sort of left and started performing on the street. and were featured in these postcards that were shipped across the world. And in chapters 3 and 4 of the book, I consider Genoa ceremonial practices and how Genoa negotiate their relationship to Islam, post-slavery Morocco, and also this idea of the Sudan or a Sudani identity. And women really play a major role in Genoa spirit possession ceremonies, which are called lila, which means night in Arabic. So when a lila is held, you usually visit a diviner, such as this is a woman named Jamia Genia, who did a divination, and this is her in front of her divination tray. And so she will tell you, she'll diagnose your illness if it's spirit related, and she could suggest that you might want to hold a lila in order to pacify the spirit who is angry at you, in order to have this sort of sort of a friendly relationship with your spirit, so your spirit doesn't cause problems for you, doesn't cause illness, doesn't cause life traumas, those types of things. So it's really, you have to hold your spirit possession ceremony, which she will organize for you. And then you fall into trance when you hear the rhythms associated with your particular spirit, when you smell the incense associated with your particular spirit, and you wear the colors associated with your particular spirit. So I really tried to focus in on the book, people's personal experiences of and with possession, and how it allows them to articulate everyday experiences and also engage with larger issues of identity, especially for women. So in chapter 4, I discuss how Genoa ceremonies are viewed by Muslims, and some may be critical of Genoa ceremonies within Morocco, because they're evoking spirits into possession. And also women are dancing in front of many people. You can see in the background of this image, this is open to the public. And so this is at a very small zawiya, a shrine in Essaouira named Dagdamana. And lots of people hear the music and they come in, because the idea is you can't block the entrance from people, because you might be denying someone who is ill a chance to heal themselves. And so they're open for the public, and people come for entertainment too, to watch and to listen to the music. But, Genoa practitioners don't see themselves as existing in conflict with Islam. So I've met many people who are possessed at ceremonies. They go to Mecca, they perform the Hajj, they perform 5 daily prayers. People will stop playing music during the Lila when they hear the call to prayers, and then they'll resume afterwards. And people will even stop and perform their prayers during a ceremony. Perhaps going into a small room off to the side. So there's a lot of tension in contemporary Morocco, which is leading, I'm trying to wrap up and speak quickly, because I know I'm not supposed to speak too long. So in chapter 5, I really talk a lot about sort of more contemporary issues, about issues of authenticity. Who is a real Genoa? Who has the right to claim a Genoa identity within contemporary Morocco? And when I was living in Essaouira for a long time, I saw a lot of tension around the Zawiya Sidna Bilal. So as Bilal is the muezzin of the Prophet Muhammad, many Genoa say they're descendants of Bilal. So this Zawiya was not actually named after Bilal, but after a man who was enslaved, whose name was Bilal, who was actually buried at the Zawiya. And so this is kind of the place where the last Genoa ceremony during the month of Shaban, which is the month before Ramadan, is held, because there are no Genoa ceremonies held during Ramadan, the Muslim month of prayer and fasting, because the spirits are said to sleep. And so this shrine was really a hot spot of contention, because a group of people had sort of taken it and renovated it and retiled it, and they invited different Sufi groups from all over Morocco to perform at it. And so many people felt that it had lost its true essence. It had been taken away from those people who were more authentic Genoa. In other words, people who saw themselves as Black, people who saw themselves as Sudani, and people who come from hereditary Genoa families, who had learned the music and who had learned spirit possession through their parents and their grandparents. So Genoa-ness is really a spot where authenticity is being negotiated. And in chapter 6, the final chapter of the book, which is actually one of my favorite chapters, I talk a lot about the Ginbri. and sort of how its meaning has changed as it's moved from place to place and into different people's hands. And so this also plays into this issue of authenticity. So the Ginbri in the past would have never been played by women. It was considered to be an instrument only performed by men, only performed by people who were hereditary Genoa musicians. And it was considered to be somewhat taboo. So many people told me when they went to play at a Genoa ceremony, which are typically held at night in small shrines or in people's homes, they would hide the instrument because people would criticize them for walking down the street holding it. It was really considered to be other and was hidden by people. And so today this has totally changed. And now you've got the Genoa Festival, and you even have young women who are starting to perform Genoa music, playing the Ginbri. And this is a young female artist, Asma Hamzawi, who's performing at the Genoa Festival. And she really sees this instrument as a counterculture symbol. So I think its connection to Blackness is one of the things that I argue that allows it to be seen in this way. She sees it as a way to express female empowerment, female liberation. And why should it just be men? Why can't women be performing? We're the ones who control the ceremony historically. Without women, the ceremony couldn't even happen, she would say. But interestingly enough, she does perform ceremonies with her father, who is also a Genoa musician and does perform Lila. But she primarily performs secular concerts like we see here on the stage. And she's performing actually with a Malian musician, Fatimatu Diawara, who also performs lots of songs about female empowerment. And so they're doing kind of a concert. They're doing a concert together here at the Genoa Festival. So this is my final image. Today, the Genoa Ginbri is even featured in contemporary art and used by Hassan Hajjaj, many contemporary artists. He's a Moroccan artist who was born in Morocco, lives in London, and travels back and forth, very cosmopolitan. And his idea is that Genoa-ness is Morocco's connection to Africa. And he sees Morocco as more of an African nation, as opposed to being connected to the Middle East and the Arab world. And so the movement of the Ginbri into these various circumstances discussed in this book really, I think, illustrates how the term Genoa as an identity is open and is used in multiple ways. It has changed over time since the end of the 19th century, and it really continues to change today. Oh, here is Hassan Hajjaj at the Newark Museum in the United States. He came to visit, and he's actually photographing a Genoa musician in New York City, in Brooklyn, who's part of a contemporary Genoa group. So I'll end there, and I look forward to hearing questions and people's responses, and I'll stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. I was just thinking as you were speaking about the capacity of Islam to absorb these spirit medium notions and the music and so on. You know, I'm very familiar with that from the Indian Muslim angle, the way in which Qawwali, for example, is also a musical form associated with these, the ability to transcend the material world and the present. So that's, anyway, I was thinking of Qawwalis all the way as you spoke about the Genoa music and wondering what those linkages globally might be. But I'm going to hand it over to Atika to begin with now to open up the discussion.
Well, first, I might ask to be made co-host. So if I have time, I want to show you a very short video at the end. So to start off, I'm grateful to Dr. Shireen Hassin for inviting me to be part of this book discussion. It is a pleasure to be able to comment on Dr. Cynthia Becker's book, Blackness in Morocco, Genoa Identity Through Music and Visual Culture. As someone who has recently been introduced to Dr. Cynthia Becker's essential contributions in the fields of Amazigh Arts, ethnography, and performance, her nuanced understanding of Moroccan cultural diversity, with a focus on marginalized communities and identities in Morocco, a topic close to heart. I'm particularly honored by this opportunity. Becker's Blackness in Morocco is as groundbreaking as it is thought-provoking. With its focus on trans-Saharan connections, Becker's book challenges dominant frameworks in African studies, which rest on older colonial divisions of North and Sub-Saharan Africa, what an Africanist colleague of mine calls the beheading of Africa, which is something that Shireen mentioned earlier. She joins recent scholarships, which has broken the long silence about trans-Saharan slavery and its legacies in Morocco. While Genoa has existed in the Arabic literature since the 12th century, as Becker made very clear in her book, no known documentation of Genoa spirit possession exists before the 19th century. So Becker took up the difficult task of uncovering how and why Genoa developed as an identity linked to Blackness and enslavement. The book makes a significant contribution, in my opinion, to understanding Genoa as a racial formation. Far from a trans-historical identity, Becker traces the historical, social, economic, and political forces that have shaped the emergence and transformation of Genoa into a unified identity in Morocco from the 19th century to the present. As Becker notes, Genoa became an identity that united people based on cultural and political understandings of Blackness. Becker successfully brings art history, including colonial postcards, photographs by contemporary Moroccan artists, as you've just seen, as well as Genoa material culture and music performances in dialogue with ethnography and immersive experiential research of Genoa spirit possessions. The book, in other words, is an excellent demonstration of the reward of interdisciplinary scholarship. Becker's book also demonstrates that connections to Blackness made through Genoa music and aesthetics are contested because they are complicated by lineage, social class, and gender. The book contributes essential understandings to what it means to be Moroccan, centering the voices of Black people and the construction of Blackness. The book spoke to me as a Moroccan Muslim, as a sociolinguist who has spent the last 2 decades studying the relationship between language and identity in Morocco, but also the language ideologies and hierarchies between North Africa and the Arabic-speaking Middle East. Several chapters took me back to my childhood, back in the 1970s. I spent most of my formative years in Morocco and experienced Genoa and Genoa-like practices of street busking and ritual healing up close. As a young kid, I remember vividly how my late pious Muslim mother never failed to tip Genoa street performers who were playing qraqab, never gnbri, often reminding me that they have the power to bless and curse, which literally instilled both awe and fear. And it is precisely what Cynthia's book captures in a fascinating way. So Genoa performers often stop playing their qraqab or castanets and rewarded us with rhyming supplications to Allah for protection, help, and wealth. As Muslims, spirits or jnoon, rahim, an integral part of our beliefs, and there is a whole arsenal in Orthodox Islamic teachings to protect oneself from these supernatural entities. The association of dark-skinned Genoa with healing and supernatural powers, and their ability to evoke and work the spirit, and I love that phrase in Cynthia's book, precisely, as Becker has convincingly argued, is central to the construction of Blackness in Morocco. It is this ambiguous position between marginality and potency that gives Genoa their mysticism and power. Their ability to evoke spirits and do so from a Muslim frame, all the while including practices considered outside Muslim Orthodox practices. In other words, evoking non-Muslim Black spirits, complicates understandings of what it means to be a Muslim Moroccan. While I have never attended the Dardaba or Lila, there are so many different regional variations of how it's called, or the all-night Genoa spirit possession ceremony that Becker's chapter 4 is dedicated to, and to which I return later on to respond to the linguistic construction of Tegnawit or Genoa identity, I want to mention that I have attended Isawa ceremonies, for example, in the city of Meknes, mostly afternoon ones, and they're really short. And also in the month of Shaban, the month before Ramadan. And in fact, in Meknes, they're called Shabana. So that the ceremonies themselves are called Shabana, and they're afternoon, performed in the afternoon. They do bear some resemblances to Genoa spirit possessions. The Sufi group, Isawa, also induced trances in the mostly female audiences who were believed to be inhabited by, or mskunin, by the spirits. And they do name some of the spirits, like Lalla Isha and Lalla Mira. Again, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and I'll explain that later on. Hardly any of the Genoa black spirits that are mentioned in chapter 4 seem to be evoked as far as I remember. I appreciated Becker's distinction and clarification of exercising the spirits versus appeasing them, because that made a lot of clarity in my head. But I was wondering where these other, mainly low-class Sufi groups like the Isawa stand in relation to Genoa, for example. To a sociolinguist like myself, the book offered food for thought for the linguistic construction of Blackness in Genoa music performances in particular, as well as the silences in my own field of language to issues relating to language and race in Morocco. Despite the diversity of languages brought by enslaved West Africans in Morocco, none seem to have survived or to have influenced the structure of Moroccan Arabic as Berber did, for example. However, it should come as no surprise that these West African languages did not survive, as the social networks that guarantee the survival and transmission of languages, even stigmatized linguistic varieties for that matter, did not exist for enslaved people who were forcibly removed from their communities. Some were sold as children or sold several times as adults. Today, the majority of Black Moroccans speak Moroccan Arabic or Berber, known as Amazigh. Black Moroccans speak the regional Arabic dialect of their respective urban or rural places in which they reside, or the social registers associated with their socioeconomic class status or level of education. The power of code switching between Moroccan Arabic, which is the vernacular Arabic spoken in Morocco that dominates in Genoa songs, and the presumably West African languages through the scattered Black words, as Becker has nicely demonstrated, who trace their identity to enslaved West Africans. Linguistic anthropologists and ethnolinguists who have examined ritual performances have demonstrated that the deliberate use of unintelligible speech is common in many kinds of ritual performances, where it usually indexes authority and supernatural expertise. Without traveling far, the use of written Quranic Arabic in amulets by some Moroccan faqihs or diviners conjures up this particular authority of the written word, especially in a largely non-literate female populace in Morocco, especially older Moroccan women. It is worth noting that the scholarship on language and identity in Morocco has looked at a number of competing language ideologies, including the hierarchies between vernacular Arabic and classical Arabic, Arabic and French, for example, French being the colonial language, the former colonial language, Arabic and Berber, the indigenous language of Morocco, which has been marginalized as a result of the Arabization policies, particularly in the post-independence period. Spanish and French and English. I was particularly intrigued by the language ideologies that permeate performances, especially the all-night pantheon of spirit possessions in chapter 4, Spirits of the Night. I must admit that I skipped this chapter at first, feeling viscerally that I had to be spiritually and emotionally ready to read it. Becker's meticulous descriptions of the progression of the all-night invocation of spirits demonstrates her amazing ability to take the reader there. I literally felt like I was there. I was terrified. And I spent a lot of time saying, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Bismillah ar-Rahman. I had to go and do my rituals. I had to go and read my Quran because I did not want the wrath of the spirits to come to me. I know this is recorded, but I really need to say that. So what I really appreciated her ability to capture the event multimodally, visually through photographs, but also linguistically through the lyrics. The images, the words, and the phrases were all too familiar to me. Some have become part of the lexicon, like Ftuh al-Rahba, which I really did not associate with Genoa at the time. I thought it was just what female diviners used, for example, because that's where you tip them before they start reading your future. I came back to it after completing the other chapters when I was ready. I appreciated Becker's tracing the semantic meanings and potential origins of some of the unintelligible words used by Genoa in their performances, and was successful in tracing some to Hausa, Fulani, and other languages south of the Sahara. However, the semantic or referential meaning of these Sudani or Black words is not as significant as their indexical meanings. If Arabic words and phrases are used to heal, so can Black words. And that's my understanding of this appeal to the Black or Sudani words, especially towards the end of the Lila, or the all-night spirit possession. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm gonna cut short. I will just to end with, it would not be an exaggeration to say that Gnawa music and aesthetics have become the face of Moroccan music today, superseding the Melhoun and Andalusi music. These are classicizing poetic music genres in Morocco that dominated the official construction of Moroccan national identity in relation to musical genres, especially in the post-independence period. The international success of Gnawa music and aesthetics has inspired Arabic-speaking Middle Eastern artists who are appropriating Gnawa music and aesthetics. And as I said, if we have time, I can show you a video, just a little clip by a Lebanese artist, which I don't know if Cynthia is aware of, the song Tlah, it's a music video that really uses the Gnawa aesthetics and the kraqab and all that. So thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thanks for that absolutely fascinating amplification of the themes in the book. And Cynthia, there are a couple of questions there for you, but if you could hold on till after Carolyn's presentation, that would be great. But Atika, do you want to quickly show that little video? Is it long? You need to unmute yourself.
Never fails. If you could make me co-host, I can share it.
I think you are co-host.
I am?
Yeah. Can't hear.
I hope you were able to see that. Okay.
We saw it, but we couldn't hear it.
Sorry about that.
That happens. Okay. We'll come back to talking about that. Thank you so much, Atika. Carolyn, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Sure, thank you. You'll see I've embedded my questions in between, and I echo many of the themes that Atika brought up here, so I'm excited to share this with you all. First, I want to thank Shireen for inviting me to join you all as a discussant. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, a privilege to join Atika Hashimi at the table and to engage with Cynthia Becker's excellent work in Blackness in Morocco. I come to the table as an ethnomusicologist who specializes in the popular Arabic spiritual songs of Egypt's Coptic Orthodox Christians. And I follow the community's ambivalent relationship first with Arabness and Islam in Egypt, and then with Blackness in the diaspora, as they recalibrate their sense of otherness from being a religious minority to a racialized one. Like the Genoa in Morocco, neighboring Copts also turn to devotional genres that straddle the thin veil between lived and spiritual realms, to emphasize, articulate, and draw power from their sense of alterity, and to reckon with their place in the world. So in short, this book was my jam, as I had mentioned when we first met. I was fascinated to learn about how hereditary Genoa musicians and diviners draw direct agency from histories, memories, and the materialities of their historical enslavement in Morocco through possession ceremonies. So this notion of like the loss of self, to find oneself. I was really interested in those, in that relationship. The critical dissonances and paradoxes of Black expressive culture, histories of enslavement in the Muslim world, as well as constructions of race, are often overlooked in the scholarship of North African expressive culture and the Middle East broadly. Becker fills in these gaps and brings us into the sights, sounds, and what's at stake for the critical conversations around Blackness in North Africa, a place dubbed by French colonialists as White Africa, and whose mainstream narratives have long leaned into Orientalist tropes to distance themselves from Blackness and the African continent. And this is something that I deal with often when I'm speaking to the Coptic Orthodox community in Egypt. Many of my thoughts and questions today have to do with these continued reckonings with race, interpolations of colonial frameworks, and the global world music market that still fetishizes marginality and a distant other as a very specific form of authentic music and authenticity. And I'm really fascinated by that kind of relationship of both playing around the commodification of what authenticity means, but also finding a space to make it into that context in the first place. My first question has to do with the trans-Saharan slave trade. This isn't the first time that the brutal histories of enslavement have resulted in rich diasporic music traditions, each with their own genealogies. Paul Gilroy's work on the Black Atlantic reminds us that reggae, zouk, high life, jazz, salsa, the blues, hip hop, soul, and spirituals, and I can go on, are some of the critical ways in which sound has played in feeling, producing, and communicating the unmooring of Black experiences on the other side of the transatlantic slave trade. Importantly, the Black Atlantic also highlights the potentially emancipatory and anti-capitalist potentials of artistic expression, and one that contains with it utopian impulses that speak to everyday politics of #LivingWhileBlack. And I'm specifically using this hashtag to sort of draw on the political dimensions of some of the conversations happening in North America and in the United States around that. We learned from Becker that Genoa music culture is largely a product of the trans-Saharan slave trade, one that targeted largely sub-Saharan and West Africans for enslavement in North Africa. It's a history that's deeply imbricated not with Christianity, but with Islam, whose law permitted the enslavement of non-Muslims and conflated Blackness with lying outside of the Ummah, or the worldwide community of Muslims. So I'm curious to put your work in conversation with Paul Gilroy's work. How do narratives around the trans-Saharan slave trade intersect with a broader sense of Genoan belonging to a Muslim ummah? Does the trans-Saharan route offer a similar utopian impulse to Gilroy's understanding of the Black Atlantic? And I get a sense of that, but I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about that. And what it may offer for Genoan practitioners that the Ummah may not offer, even as a racial reckoning continues in Morocco, and conversations are changing about Genoa and Genoan practitioners. Genoa's quasi-Muslim status or classification as a fringe Sufi sect, and sometimes even outside of a Sufi context, not considered Sufi in itself, is complicated further by the special status of the first muezzin, Bilal, an Abyssinian man who became the first follower of Prophet Muhammad. One of Genoa's origin stories we learn from you is that Bilal made a drum or a lute from a palm tree and danced in service of Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, reinforcing a connection to enslavement, music making, and barakah from Bilal to today's Genoa musicians. As you explain, Bilal's figure and stories lead to well-known tropes of Black bodies as, quote, musical. In American context, Ronaldo Rodano explores this conflation of racial and musical discourses in American modernism and the idea of Black hot rhythms that, while they perpetuated derogatory racial myths, also allowed Black musicians to navigate creative economies that would have been otherwise outside of their reach due to segregation. Hot rhythms created considerable anxiety for American modernists, from the fear of slave rebellions, so the taking away of drums, to sexual impropriety. So the next question that the next musings that I was thinking of as I was reading your book was, given the institutional power of Arab-centric Islam and Moroccan-classed superstitions of low-order Islam that is similarly anxious around music and rhythm, I wonder if you can elaborate more about how Genoan musicians talk about the racialization of rhythm and rhythmically driven music in this context. I wonder if there was any direct conversations about the rhythm itself. To complicate things further, the formation and the visual fixation of Genoa as a racialized identity associated with Blackness also emerged under a colonial gaze, men publicly configuring their performances for the arrival of the camera in the late 19th century, close to the establishment of the French protectorate in 1912. It's interesting to note that among Egypt's Copts, Coptic liturgical music similarly emerged as a musical canon in the public sphere and was largely gendered as male in that space after the arrival of another technology, the phonograph and the music transcriber in the position of a missionary. And they took snapshots in Western musical notations, making the genre more authentic than the ones that scholars did not study. My curiosity is piqued by these parallels, namely how the materialities of modernity, as brought on by colonialism and capitalism, shape and produce conversations around authenticity. So my last question, or my second to last question here, is drawing on Genoan public formation under a European gaze, how do Genoan conversation contest or come to terms with neoliberal commodifications of authenticity that directly feed into contemporary world music festivals? In other words, given the deeply spiritual dimensions of Genoa's spirit possessions, I'm curious to learn more about the ambivalences, or perhaps not, that interlocutors may have shared about going globally public, particularly to an audience that doesn't have this Moroccan context or the contemporary conversations happening around Blackness, Genoan musicians, and Genoa within their ear. So these are the three sort of formal questions that I had for you. And then my last one, piqued by hearing you talk about the paper again, is a question about positionality. I'm really curious. I'd love to learn more what it was like to do this research as an American scholar, and particularly seeing your book become published in 2020, so in the middle of the plague, but particularly to the backdrop of 2020's reckoning for racial justice in the Black Lives Matter movement that took place in the US. And I'm curious to see how that fed into some of the conversations happening in Morocco, and how people translated that for local context in relationship to Genoa and to Blackness there. So that's what I have for you. I'm excited to have a conversation about these questions, and I'm thankful that you're squeezing us in on your busy day. So that's what I have.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was another fabulous set of questions and interventions. Cynthia, I'm going to let you respond first, and then maybe we'll have time for one or possibly two questions from other people in the on the webinar.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Atika and Carolyn, for your comments. I'm so flattered by them, and I'm so happy that you like the book. And Atika, it's very it's very flattering that you felt like you were at a Lila when you read chapter 4, which was frankly the hardest chapter for me to write. And I attended so many Lila and devoted so much of my time and my energy to going to Lila that I felt like I could have written an entire book just about the Lila, but it was the hardest topic for me as well. It's very it's hard to write, I think, without sounding very descriptive, and many people have done that already. There has been many books about Genoa. And many of them will sort of tell the story of the Lila from beginning to end. And I decided that I didn't really want to do that. And I really liked the idea that a French scholar, Bertrand Hell, wrote about the Lila being kind of like an ethno-drama, sort of like a piece of theater with different actors involved, and every Lila had its own character, and the energy was amazing, and it really was, you know, you devote. I mean, it just takes over so much of your life. Took over so much of my life when I was going to them, and you know, some of them last days when somebody will have a Lila. So I was taking notes when everyone was speaking, and I think I'll just sort of go through, and then maybe if I leave something out, you can ask me to clarify as I'm going. But you know, one of the things that I mentioned that I did is that I listened. I had a Ma'allam named Mahmoud Guinea, who was from a hereditary Genoa family, agreed to allow me to record all the songs of Alila, which he just performed at his house. And rather than use karakab, people use cassette tapes and sort of hit them in rhythm like the karakab, because the karakab are so loud, it would overpower the gimbri. And then I recorded, and then we sat down with his daughter, and she was helping me as well. And we wrote everything out in Arabic, and then we worked on translating. And I mean, it was a lot of work and fascinating though, because at that point I felt like I could really understand how the Lila was unfolding. And it was very codified, a very particular way. And the Lila in Essaouira are very different from a Lila in Marrakesh or a Lila in another urban center within Morocco. So everyone sort of had its own character, which leads me to the idea of, you had asked about, you had spoken about the West African languages, and you know, everyone, when I was writing down the words, if it wasn't Moroccan Arabic, I was asking, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I would ask different people, and people sort of had different explanations, or they would just say, oh, it's Sudani. You know, I don't know. It's just Sudani, which I do assert, and I agree with you. This gives the language the supernatural ability and appeal to people when it is a Sudani language. And also people told me that if I had attended Lila 20 years before I did this project, or 10 years even, or if I was able to go to a Lila that was done in the Sweri style. So Sweri means from the city of Essaouira. There would be many, many, many more Sudani words than if I attended a Lila that would be done in Marrakesh or something like that. Rabawi, they would call it. And so they would say, well, the Sweri style was the most potent style, the most powerful style of Lila, because it did have more Sudani words. But they said, you know, we kind of took those out because of popular demand. The public who was coming to the Lila, they didn't understand those words. They wanted more, you know, Darija, Moroccan Arabic, and so they could relate to the songs more. And sometimes people sing along to the songs at a Lila. And so, so that they said, you know, that it had changed sort of the character of the Lila, but it's, you know, almost everybody played the Rabawi style of Lila when I was there. There was one person who played the Sweri style, that was it. And even then he didn't have a lot of songs with a lot of the old songs. So I talked about one song in my book called Musu Korninana. And I don't even know if I would say called. I couldn't really come up with titles for songs because they don't have titles. And, but I would usually kind of name the song in my head based on what was the most frequent phrase that was repeated. So Musu Korninana is actually Bamanakan. So in Morocco, you'll hear people saying that Genoa are Bambara. They're descendants of Bambara. So Bambara is the word, I speak about it a lot in my book, that people in North Africa give to Bamana in West Africa. And Bambara is historically understood as an othering word, an othering mechanism. It's a word that you give to Africans, or Sahelian Africans who are non-Muslims. Oh, and then that person is just a Bambara. They're acting crazy. They're acting like a pagan. They're just a Bambara. And you even find reference to the word Bambara in notes about the transatlantic slave trade. There will be many records where people are called Bambara. and listed in those terms. And so there's a song in the Genoa repertoire called Walad Bambara, or Children of Bambara, or Descendants of Bambara. And in those songs, people do speak a lot about the experience of enslavement within those songs. And those are not part of the spirit possession ceremony. So those happen before the spirit possession portion. And sometimes they'll even play the day before spirit possession happens during a lila. So, you know, I did do a lot of work speaking to many linguists. I have traveled to Niger, Mali, Senegal. When I was in Niger, I went to an African Language Institute, and we sat down and people looked at the songs with me. And I'm at an African Studies Center at Boston University too. And I spoke to many people who know Hausa and Wolof. And interestingly enough, most of the words were not Bamanakan, unless they have just been lost. The only ones I could find was Musukorinana, which means the old woman came, Musukorinana. So, and when that possession happens, there's the person who is possessed is sort of lying on the ground and kind of can't move and is kind of paralyzed. One of her legs, well, because it's a female spirit, so I'm calling the possessed her, regardless of the gender, cannot move. That was really the only thing. So that was a surprise for me. I was expecting to find more, but maybe it doesn't matter. Like you said, it doesn't matter what the language is. What matters is that those words are extremely powerful and the potency that they carry and sort of the mystery that surrounds it, those words as well, which I think gives them so much, the healing abilities that they have. And, you know, there were certain words I wrote about in the book that were only performed by the Genia family during a lila, and they considered those words to be special to their family, that their family members had brought from various parts of Sahelian Africa, and they only performed them during their lila that they had. They were the only family in Essaouira who performed these particular songs. And so people really hold on to these words as very personal. And they do have extreme potency. I love the video that you showed. I'm sorry we couldn't hear the music, but I'm going to go look it up. But I could see she was twirling her head, the singer, wearing a cap with kind of a cowrie shell on the end, which is one of the gestures that Genoa male musicians will do when they're performing on the streets. And you're right about going to people's houses and collecting money, because one of offerings. So one of the things that I saw is people were afraid not to give Genoa buskers some kind of offering, because you needed the baraka from Genoa, and that still happens today, even though it's decreased a lot in contemporary Morocco. You still find it in the countryside, though, in rural areas. I see it happening. And I do agree, Genoa music is the national music of Morocco at this point. If you can find someone who doesn't know how to sing Lala Aisha, like, who are those people in Morocco, right? Or know the words to Lala Aisha. So interestingly enough, and I wanted to talk about this, is that there's a very popular Genoa song dedicated to a spirit named Lala Aisha. And almost always, if you go to this Genoa and World Music Festival, it will be performed, and people will sort of, in this audience of thousands of people, there are 40,000 people who can go to this Genoa festival, and mostly Moroccans. There's some foreigners, but it's a big Moroccan crowd that goes. People love this music, and people will sort of fall into trance or dance like they're possessed during these secular staged concerts. And the interesting thing is that the song Lala Aisha is actually associated with the Hamadcha Brotherhood, which leads me to your question about the Aisawa. So the Aisawa, Hamadcha, these are all Sufi brotherhoods or Sufi groups that are considered to be somewhat lower status within Morocco. I have attended Aisawa in Tafilet Oasis and the Ple de Riata, which is like the kind of a horn, like an oboe. So the instruments are very different. But I think in Essaouira in particular, there was a Hamedsha shrine, there was an Isawa shrine, there was the Genoa shrine. And during Shaban, the same people would kind of go from shrine to shrine to go to the different ceremonies that people would hold. And sometimes I found that Genoa musicians themselves or Genoa participants were also associated with Hamedsha and would go to Hamedsha or go to Isawa events. And so I think this is the influence and the cross-pollination that's happening. So the song Lala Aisha, going back to it, is actually associated with a different Sufi group, and it permeated into Genoa music. And I write about this in the book, some musicians even refuse to play the song because they view it as too commercial or coming from outside, or this is just the popular Genoa song. Why are we playing it? It doesn't mean anything. But it's the most popular. If you go to a ceremony and the song is played, it's really powerful with young women. Hurry up. Okay.
I had to speed you up a little bit, Cynthia.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So question about utopia, Paul Gilroy, and utopian impulses in the Ummah. It's extremely complex. I don't think that there are any people I know who are affiliated with Genoa who would not see themselves as part of the Ummah. And I think that, one of the things that I have seen a lot is that different critiques of Genoa practices will cause sometimes these things to be removed from a Genoa Lila. So one thing I can think of is I went to an Ism Khan rural area to attend the Sadaqah, and they used to circle around this sort of a little pile of stones on the ground. And this would be the marking, kind of like a zawiya, a marking of where they were beginning their ceremony. And some people said, well, no, this is counter to Islam. We're not supposed to be circling these stones. This is kind of like we've made a zawiya. We've made sort of a place for a false god. So then the couple of, sort of older people, elders would circle, and then nobody else would do it. And so I think that sometimes the impact of Islam has caused some things to be taken out of ceremonies in a lot of ways, as opposed to people sort of rejecting Islam and seeing Genoa as offering them something different. And I do think, people do go to Hajj, they do, pray in the middle of a Lila. So that's very common. And then sometimes, I've met people who've gone to the pilgrimage of Mecca, and then they'll still go to the Genoa ceremonies, but then they won't do jitaba. They won't allow themselves to be possessed. And people will do things like put a needle in their clothing because the iron will stop the spirits or something like that. So that's sometimes what people will say. Let's see. The rhythms, what do the rhythms you had asked say about people, say about how do people view the rhythms themselves? So I'm not an ethnomusicologist, and I didn't do so much with the rhythms themselves. I know there are certain rhythms associated with different Sufi brotherhoods that have been brought in, like the Hamedsha rhythm that has been brought in to Genoa ceremonies. And, but I will say that sometimes people say the sound of the instruments like karakab or even the sarcel. So the sarcel is kind of this metal piece that's attached to the end of the ginbri, and it kind of rattles. The sound that it makes, people will say sounds like chains, the chains worn by slaves. And so this is why we play them. They'll say, this is why we play karakab, because it's the sound of the chains. And so it reminds people of, or paying tribute to that. So each rhythm is really a rhythm associated with the particular type of spirit. And there are some rhythms that are considered to be, for white spirits, more, I guess, associated with Sufism in different Sufi groups, as opposed to Black spirits, which would be the more, I guess, African sounding rhythms in people's minds, what they would define as African or Sudani rhythms. And then the question about modernity And what does it say about Genoa authenticity, and how are people coming in terms with being part of a global world? I think that people have different reactions, but I do think that there was a study that was done by an ethnomusicologist named Macy Sun, I think that's her name. And she looked at songs that were played on the stage, and she looked at songs that were played within the ceremonial context, and they're the same songs, the exact same songs. So there was no transfer whatsoever. But people do not play incense, do not burn incense during a secular performance on a stage. And I was once at a secular performance that was part of the Genoa festival that was held indoors, and it was kind of a satellite concert. And somebody did start burning jawi, which is an incense associated with Genoa. And a muqaddama, so a diviner, Genoa diviner, stood up and put that incense out and said, this is not the place for that. We're here playing a concert, we're playing music, but we are not, you know, doing something for the spirits here. So she really saw the difference. And so where it's not different songs, I do think it's different attitudes and relationships. And I do think, I mean, people really view the stage concerts as entertainment, even though people are taking sacred songs and putting them on the stage. And I think that that's been written about a lot, as well as terms of the Mouride Brotherhood in Senegal and songs for Sheikh Amadou Bamba. Those are often sacred songs that have been taken by Youssou N'Dour, you know, the Senegalese popular musician, and then placed on the stage. And some people have a problem with that, but, you know, most people don't. And, but I do think you don't burn the incense, you don't wear the clothing associated with spirits. And I've never seen anyone on the stage falling into possession. I have seen people on the ground watching the concert, but these are also people who, you know, don't really know that much about Genoa and are just kind of in it to watch the music. And I think sometimes responding how they think they're supposed to respond to the music, if that makes sense. And how did I feel as an American scholar in Black Lives Matter? And I mean, I haven't gone to Essaouira in 2 years because of COVID. And, you know, there is an anti-racist campaign that I write about a little bit in the book called Masmitish Azzi. So Azzi is a pejorative term that means Black. It refers to someone who has very dark skin. And, you know, if you walk down the street in Morocco and you have very dark skin, people might say Azzi, Azzi to you. And people will be very they will, oops. Okay, so many people who identify as Sudani, sometimes they tell me stories that they're approached on the street and people will say, you know, speak to them in French. Who are you? Where are you from? Or something. And then they'll speak Derija. And they'll say, oh, okay, you're us, you're Moroccan, right? And so Derija, like the language, which is interesting for language studies as well, has become, I think, a tool for people to identify themselves as authentic Moroccans and part of the Moroccan, you know, landscape. So that has been an issue in many recent years. So yes, I think I'll stop there. And
Cynthia, there's just one, so far just one question in the chat. Nduka, are you still here? Do you want to ask that question? Or else I can pose it. Maybe he has left. But Nduka Otiono, my colleague, our colleague in African Studies, asks if there could be a little more discussion of Arab colonization of Black Africans, which of course is your chapter 1, I think, in your book. I mean, it is discussed in your book, but I don't know if you or anyone on the panel want to respond to that question, or wanting I guess he's not here to put that to you.
Well, I'm assuming that they mean Arabs moving in from North Africa into the Sahel. I'm assuming is what that's
Arab
about.
colonization of Black Africans is what he's asking. So I presume the question of how slaves came to be in Morocco in the first place.
Well, I mean, it's a very, very long history of a slave trade, right? So, I mean, this really plays into the Genoa origin story as well, because of 1591 is the conquering of Timbuktu and other places in the Sahel, the Songhai dynasty, by the Saadian dynasty within Morocco. And so the story is that many men were taken, and also women, from Sahelian Africa, defeated, the defeated army, and brought up into North Africa to serve as the soldiers for the Sultan. And so many Genoa do trace ancestry to these soldiers. And so this is where the word Bambara comes from as well. And Wale Bambara, and the idea of being Bambara, because many of the people who were enslaved would have been those classified as Bambara or pagans, right? And I do talk a great deal about that idea of who could be enslaved, which was a really big issue in medieval times and during this, Renaissance, this period of the 16th century, when, who you can't enslave a fellow Muslim. And then some of the responses was always, well, these people and these Bambara are not good Muslims. They might say they're Muslim, but they're not really. They're not really practicing Islam. And so people would be enslaved anyway. And there's a book called Black Morocco written by a Moroccan scholar named Shoki El Hamel. And he writes a great deal about sort of the process of trans-Saharan slavery. He is a historian, so he has more of that than I do in my book. And he talks about sort of the re-enslavement of people considered to be Black, people considered to be Sudani or having dark skin, Kel, or Amazigh, all these words used in North Africa for Blackness. The re-enslavement of people who had dark skin, he saw it as re-enslavement. Some of these people had never been slaves, because there's also an old migration of people from the Sahel and the Sahara with dark skin into North Africa who have no connection to slavery. So, I mean, what is it, not every person who is Sudani had a history of slavery, of enslavement. So so Moulay Ismail is the name of the Sultan in the late 16th, early 17th century. He decided that he wanted to raise a massive armies like the sultans before. And so he said, anybody who is Black in Morocco can be a slave. And many people argued with him. Many Muslim jurists argued with him that you don't have the right to do this. And he did it anyway, and amassed this massive army. He was considered to be very much, I'm not going to say it. I'll let Atiqa say it. The tyrant and, kind of a harsh ruler and things like that. So, and it was extremely controversial. So, so that happened as well.
I suspect there's quite a long discussion to be had, which also links up to Carolyn's question about who is part of the Ummah and who is not, and how that's defined and when that's defined, and about racism in Arab countries.
And I do say, being a white American in doing this topic, I know you had asked me about that and I didn't really address it, I guess. I forgot. I felt like there's probably a lot of stuff people would refuse to tell me. Many things people did tell me because I was sort of out of the structure. I'm not Moroccan. And so I can say, often, hey, well, in the US, we had this history, or in the US, this happened. Because, we have a terrible history of slave trade in the United States. And then people would kind of share stories in that way with me. So, and it was, young Moroccan women who sat me down and said, you've got to know these things about skin color and what people say. And, you don't know this, and educated me in that way. So, I mean, what can I say? it was one of the things that I was trying to be careful about, is to not take my American point of view and apply it within a North African context. And I was trying to be careful of that. And I was always aware of that and always thinking about that. So hopefully I did it, but I'm sure someone else could do the same study and come up with something completely different, as we all know, right?
I mean, the
Thank
point,
you so much. Yeah, it's fascinating here. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure. And I think what is absolutely outstanding about the book is, I mean, struck me how much scholarship went into it and over what a long period of time, and how much immersion there was in the research spread out across this period. So I'm not so sure it's so easy to do a book like this, which, you know, sounded from reading the book, you know, wasn't your primary project when you started listening to it. And that's from a methodological point of view, that also struck me, that the way in which certain things nag at you when you're on one research path, and then, you know, I was much more struck by the way in which you were attracted to the sounds and rituals because of your experience of Mardi Gras and your openness to it, and that kind of seemed to have drawn you in. So I'm not sure that 20 odd years of scholarship should be dismissed so easily, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know what to say.
But thank you. It is a scholarship that really does show in the book, and I want to thank you so much for that. And for you know, I learned a huge amount from this. And as I said, I did think maybe if you do an audio book and then you can hyperlink some little sound clips, that would be so great. But it was good to have that little clip to hear what a Gwynbra sounded like, you know, for these instruments are also different. But thank you also to these stellar comments from Attica and Carolyn. They really, I think, you know, they took us into the book in a way, in a much deeper way, made us see things in the book, and also, you know, raised some larger questions about where this fits into the scholarship. In, you know, where your book fits into a larger scholarship. So thank you to them. Thank you to you. Cynthia has to go and teach a class in 7 minutes. So we're going to say goodbye and thank you all for coming. Our next seminar is going to be with Christopher Omar about childhood in the diaspora. Black childhoods in the diaspora. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you all buy the book. Femi kindly put a link to the book in the chat, so it's readily available. You know, a really great contribution to our discussions in African studies, and I'm sure in music as well, and in art history as well. So thank you for bringing all that together for us. Take care, everyone. Go well.
Very nice to see you.
Thank you.